One of the biggest criticisms of wildlife tourism in India is overcrowding. And honestly, I get it. If your first impression of an Indian safari is dozens of jeeps surrounding a tiger, cameras firing from every direction, roads getting jammed, it can completely feel chaotic. Almost less like wildlife and more like a show. And over the years, Indian safaris have slowly developed this reputation that they are overcrowded, commercialized, even borderline unethical. But here's what makes this conversation complicated. Despite of all of these problems, India is home to nearly 70% of world's wild tigers, which raises a difficult but important question. What if the same tourism system that people criticize is also part of the reason those tigers still exist? Because if wildlife tourism in India is really this problematic, then why does the system continue to exist the way it does? Why would forest departments allow it? Why would conservation authorities tolerate this? And why, despite of all this criticism, all these problems, has India still managed to become home to nearly 70% of world's wild tigers? To understand this, we have to go back in time and realize how close India came to losing tigers altogether. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, historical estimates suggest that India may have had between 80,000 and 100,000 tigers spread across the country. But over the next several decades, that population collapsed. One of the biggest reasons was unregulated trophy hunting during the British colonial rule. British officers, royalty, and even Indian Maharajas competed over hunting records. Some estimates suggest that more than 80,000 tigers were killed for sport between 1875 and 1925 alone. While researching for this video, I came across these taxidermists based out of Mysore, and they were called as Van Ingen and Van Ingen. Their records show that they processed and stuffed more than 25,000 tigers in just the first 50 years of operation. Just think about that for a second. That's more than one tiger being killed and turned into a trophy every single day for 50 years straight. And this wasn't even the full extent of tiger hunting in India. This was just one taxidermy business operating largely out of southern India. Now, at the same time, the tiger's habitat was disappearing rapidly. Forests were cleared for agriculture, expanding human settlements, railways, dams, commercial logging. Large connected landscapes slowly became fragmented islands of forests, isolating tiger populations from one another. And even after India gained independence in 1947 from British colonial rule, conservation was not immediately the national priority. Nation building, understandably, took center stage. The country was more focused on development of infrastructure, food production, and economic growth. So forests continued shrinking, and tiger populations kept falling. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, the situation had become quite alarming. In 1972, India's official tiger census estimated that only 1,800 tigers remained in the entire country. A country that may once have had close to 100,000 tigers had been reduced to under 2,000. And for the first time, the possibility of India losing its tigers altogether no longer felt impossible. This is where India's equation with the tiger began to change. In 1972, the government of India passed the Wildlife Protection Act, one of the most important conservation laws in India's history. And for the first time, wildlife protection was treated as a national priority rather than just a regional issue. And just 1 year later, in 1973, Project Tiger was launched. The project began with 9 tiger reserves, covering approximately 18,000 square kilometers of protected forest. The idea was simple but ambitious at the same time. Create secure habitats where tigers could survive, breed, and recover without any of the pressures that had pushed them towards collapse. Over the following decades, India steadily expanded the system. More reserves were added, core protected areas were created. Villages were relocated from some of these most critical tiger habitats. Forest departments became more organized around long term wildlife protection. But even with all these measures in place, tiger conservation in India was far from a solved problem. By the late 20th century, tiger killing had evolved far beyond trophy hunting. Organized traffic networks emerged across the country, feeding international demand for tiger skins, bones, and other body parts. A major driver of this trade was the demand from China. In parts of China, tiger bones were believed to have medicinal properties, and they were widely used in products like tiger bone wine and traditional remedies that people claimed could help with things like arthritis, increasing strength, and vitality. And perhaps the most infamous person associated with this trade was a man called Sansar Chand, operating primarily out of Delhi from the 1970s to the early 2000s. Sansar Chand became one of the biggest wildlife traffickers India had ever seen. Investigators linked his network to poaching operations across some of India's most critical tiger habitats, spanning Uttar Pradesh, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, and Uttarakhand. And I looked at some court records as well. They describe a highly organized interstate smuggling network dealing in tiger skins, leopard skins, bones, claws, and many other wildlife parts. According to some sources that I found on the internet, Sansar Chand allegedly admitted to selling 470 tiger skins and more than 2000 leopard skins to buyers connected in Nepal and Tibet. And the consequences of this became brutally visible in 2005 when Sariska Tiger Reserve in Rajasthan was found to have lost all its tigers to poaching. An entire tiger reserve had effectively become empty, and the crisis extended far beyond that. In 2006, India's first modern scientific tiger estimation revealed that only 1,411 tigers remained in the entire country. The situation had simply become catastrophic. But it also became a turning point. Monitoring systems improved, anti poaching efforts became more aggressive, and wildlife crime enforcement became far more coordinated at a national level. Sansar Chand himself was eventually arrested in 2005. And perhaps more importantly, Sariska itself did not remain empty. Tigers were reintroduced in Sariska from Ranthambore, making it one of India's first successful tiger reintroduction projects. And slowly, India's tiger population started recovering, not just in Sariska but nationwide. From roughly 1,411 tigers recorded in 2006, India's tiger population has now risen to roughly 3,700, and this is based on the census India did in 2022. Today, India has more than 50 tiger reserves, I think 58 to be precise, spread across more than 80,000 square kilometers. And that, frankly, is a huge success. But recovering tiger populations also create a very difficult reality. Because as tiger numbers increase, interactions between humans and tigers increase too. And the people living closest to these forests are often the ones paying the highest price for conservation. See, tigers are notorious for hunting cattle from villages that are at the periphery of these forests. And for many families, losing even a single animal can be a serious economic blow. And then, obviously, there's a far more serious reality. Human lives are lost too. In fact, some reports that I came across show that 418 people were killed in tiger attacks in India across 2020 and 2025. And these conflicts at times lead to retaliatory killings of tigers. One of the most common methods is poisoning. A tiger kills livestock, villagers poison the carcass, and when the tiger returns to feed on it, it simply dies. In 2024, a tigress and her four cubs were found dead in Hills in Karnataka. And this was again a case of retaliatory killing where tiger had killed livestock. Now, besides human tiger conflicts, Conservation also creates severe ramifications for the local communities that live near the forests. As protected areas expand and core habitats become more protected or more regulated, some communities lose access to these forests that they have depended on for generations. In certain cases, villages are relocated altogether from critical tiger habitats. And while many of these relocations are often voluntary or compensation based, they are still at times deeply emotional and disruptive processes for the people involved. And whether justified or not, these kind of changes can create a sense of resentment towards the animal itself. To be honest, if conservation only creates restrictions, conflict, and economic hardship for the local communities, then expecting people to simply love the tiger, that's just not realistic. So, one thing becomes absolutely clear: tiger conservation cannot succeed without improving the lives of the people living around tiger habitats. As bad as it may sound, the tiger has to become valuable not just ecologically, but economically too. And this is where wildlife tourism starts becoming an important part of any conservation model. Tourism brings economic activity into landscapes that were once seen only through the lens of conflict and restriction. And once wildlife starts generating livelihoods, the equation starts to change. Drivers, guides, resort staff, naturalists, forest workers, local transport operators, small businesses, restaurants, for example, entire local economies around many tiger reserves today are directly or indirectly tied to wildlife tourism. And this is how the tiger starts becoming economically viable to people living around these forests, not as skin, not as a trophy, but alive. And that shift matters enormously because the same communities that could have once seen the tiger purely as a threat now have a reason to protect it. And at the same time, tourism also changes the visibility of these forests. Many tiger reserves today have hundreds of safari vehicles moving through designated tourism zones every single day. Guides, drivers, forest guards, and tourists are constantly present inside these landscapes. And while I recognize that tourism alone cannot obviously stop poaching, for example, but constant human involvement and monitoring make many forms of these illegal activities harder to hide, especially inside these active tourism zones. And also, over time, wildlife tourism also begins giving these forests political and economic importance. A tiger reserve that supports livelihoods, tourism revenue, local businesses, and entire regional economies becomes much harder to ignore or treat as unused land. Simply put, these forests stop being empty places on a map. They become economically active landscapes tied to jobs, infrastructure, public attention, and state revenue. And that changes how governments and institutions begin looking at them. Which is why the overcrowding conversation becomes more complicated than it first appears. Because what looks like chaos on the surface is undeniably also a part of a system that has helped keep both the tiger and its landscape alive. See, the conversation around overcrowding in Indian forests needs a wider perspective because when videos of crowded tiger sightings go viral online, they often create the impression that this is what all Indian forests look like all the time. But that's simply not true. Most of the tourism in Indian tiger reserves happens only in tourism zones, which are often only 15 to 20% of the entire jungle. Large portions of these reserves, including the core critical tiger habitats, remain inaccessible to tourists altogether. So, not every tiger in India spends its life surrounded by safari vehicles. Most of them are rarely seen, some of them are never seen at all. And you have to realize this: Conservation is not about creating the perfect experience for every individual tiger or for tourists for that matter. It's about protecting a species. Think about this: protecting a species in a country with more than 1.4 billion people, where every piece of land is under constant pressure from humans, is not an easy job. That conservation process is never going to look perfectly clean or ideal all the time. It's going to be messy, complicated, and sometimes just downright uncomfortable. Now, does all of this mean overcrowding is good? Absolutely not. It's a real problem in many Indian forests. There are cases of irresponsible tourism and poor crowd control. And conservation success obviously cannot always become an excuse for chaos. But at the same time, I also think it's very important to understand the bigger picture. See, why does overcrowding happen in the first place? Almost every tourist visiting a tiger reserve wants to see a tiger, just like how every wildlife photographer visiting a tiger reserve wants to come back with a tiger photograph. Very few people are genuinely okay with returning empty handed. And this creates pressure across the entire tourism ecosystem. I have personally witnessed tourists getting angry at guides and drivers after safaris when there were no sightings. And at the same time, good sightings often mean better tips, better reviews, more demand, and more business. So eventually, everyone inside the reserve enters the same cycle. Everyone is searching for the tiger. But also, I think it would be naive on our part to ignore the other side of this entirely. Because this same obsession with tigers is also what fuels tourism, public attention and interest, and ultimately conservation itself. Social media plays a huge role here. A single tiger today can become nationally recognizable overnight, and whether we like it or not, whether it's right or wrong, that attention matters. It keeps the tiger culturally relevant in modern India. It makes people care, it makes people emotionally invested in protecting these animals. Now, the next obvious question is, can we do something to reduce overcrowding? And yes, the governments and authorities can do many things. Bring in stricter controls, add more regulations. But honestly, I don't want to spend time in talking about that because most of it is outside our control. I think it's far more useful to focus on what we can control ourselves. The first thing you can do is that the next time you visit one of these forests, don't make the entire safari about chasing tigers. Experience the forest, look for other animals, do some birding. Pay attention to the smaller moments too. And if a sighting already has dozens of vehicles crowded around an animal, maybe don't add one more vehicle to that chaos. Ask your drivers and guides to move on. See, you have to realize that wildlife tourism becomes better only when the people inside that system start behaving better too. And we, as tourists or wildlife photographers, we are a critical part of that system. We are the ones going into the forest. So there is some responsibility on us as well to behave responsibly. The second thing I would advise you to do is stop putting constant pressure on your guides and drivers for tiger sightings. Let them take some risks. Let them explore the quieter parts of the park. And trust me, some of the best tiger sightings happen away from the regular crowded spots. See, if every safari is judged only by whether a tiger was seen or not, guides and drivers eventually have no choice but to keep returning to the same high probability areas over and over again. And that leads to crowding. And the last thing that you can do is follow the rules of the park and appreciate the guides and drivers who follow them too. See, naturally, without even realizing it, we end up rewarding only sightings. But ethical guiding and driving matters too. So that's pretty much about it. See, I'm not in any way a conservation expert, and neither am I claiming to be one. I'm just someone who spends a lot of time in these forests, someone who is probably both a part of this entire system as a tourist and in some ways a part of the problem too. But the more time I spend around these forests, the more I realize that conservation in the real world is not that simple. Nothing about this is ideal. The world was never supposed to look like this. Humans have already wiped out, I think, 80% of wild mammals on this planet. So now, in this deeply flawed world that we've created, there are still people trying to protect what remains, trying to help wildlife survive. And that process is not always going to look perfect, not for the animals and not for humans either. If you like this video, consider subscribing to the channel. I am Shantanu and I'll see you in the next one.